Good afternoon. It's wonderful to be with you. And Professor Walt, thank you so much for coming to Chicago on this beautiful weekend.
It's a pleasure to be back here. The weather is just like I remember.
We're going to chat for a bit, and then, as is customary here at the Chicago Humanities Festival, open up the floor to you for your questions for Professor Walt. When we do, we just ask that you make sure your question is, in fact, a question, and that you keep it short and to the point so we can get to as many of you as possible. But I thought I might begin, since it seems everybody else in the media world is on this subject this weekend, by having you talk a little bit about President Trump and this administration in the first 100 days. How would you assess what we have seen over these last 2.5 or 3.5 months from a foreign policy standpoint?
I'm amazed that Trump has come up in this conversation. Well, certainly the first 100 days has not been boring. But I actually would go back in terms of foreign policy and just remind everybody what happened in 2016 when Donald Trump declared he was going to run for president, and nobody really took this seriously. And yet he then steamrolls through the Republican primary season, wins the nomination. And while he's campaigning, he's opposed by virtually the entire foreign policy establishment, Democrats and Republicans alike. Now, it's not surprising that Democratic foreign policy experts opposed him. That makes perfect sense. But he was opposed by hundreds of senior, experienced Republican foreign policy experts who actually wrote open letters, published them in prominent places. One of these letters declared that Trump was utterly unfit for the office of president. Right? And again, these were Republicans questioning his candidacy. And yet, he wins the election. And of course, it's not surprising that these experts on both sides of the aisle were skeptical, if not downright alarmed, because he, in the course of the campaign, had challenged a whole series of orthodoxies in American foreign policy, had challenged essentially the policies that the Clinton administration, the Bush administration, and the Obama administration had all followed, a policy of viewing the United States as the indispensable power, responsible for running essentially a liberal world order, had questioned the value of NATO, had questioned the entire trading order that the United States had been promoting for decades, questioned our opposition to nuclear proliferation in a number of key parts of the world. And when you think about it, again, his questioning that wasn't all that surprising, because to a first approximation, the track record of U.S. foreign policy since the end of the Cold War was not that great. It was not that successful. We were still at war in Iraq and Afghanistan with no particular end in sight. Our relationship with Russia, which had been pretty good back in the 1990s, was at its lowest point since the Cold War ended. China's power had been steadily increasing. It was becoming more assertive in Asia. The Arab world, of course, was in flames, and in no small part because of things the United States had done in Iraq, in Libya, and elsewhere. So when Donald Trump in April 2016 gave a major foreign policy speech and declared American foreign policy as, quote, a complete and total disaster, a lot of Americans nodded their heads and agreed with that, whether it was right or wrong. And I just remind everybody else that Bernie Sanders on the left was saying many of the same things and winning a surprising degree of support when he questioned these fundamental principles of U.S. foreign policy. So Trump gets elected and begins by declaring in his inauguration speech that he's going to run an America First foreign policy. And he begins in the first few weeks to pursue a series of policies that look quite unorthodox, appointing some unusual people to key positions, most notably Michael Flynn as National Security Advisor, tearing up the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a trade agreement that had very important geopolitical and strategic implications, again, holding confrontational phone calls, get-acquainted calls with the Prime Minister of Australia, one of America's staunchest allies, and the President of Mexico, a very important bilateral relationship, continuing to declare that he's going to somehow build a wall on our southern border, and even more bizarrely, get Mexico, which opposes the wall, to pay for it, an act of magic that he still has not quite explained. In any case, he starts off suggesting that he is, in fact, going to move in a very different direction in a number of key foreign policy areas, and he's going to do it with an unusual crowd of people. All right. And what we've seen, I think, over the next 100 days or so has been the foreign policy establishment that scorned him and opposed him has slowly been reining him in. Not completely. Nobody's gotten a hold of his Twitter account yet. But in a number of key areas, his policies are beginning to look much more familiar. Not completely, but much more familiar. And in fact, in some cases, not that different from what I suspect a President Hillary Clinton might have done.
And what explains that? That the flip-flops, if some have said it, the reversals, the evolution in policy, whatever you want to call it, over really the last 20 to 30 days almost.
Yeah, I think there's several parts to it. One is that Trump, in fact, was not deeply informed about foreign affairs, and he didn't have deep convictions. And we've seen a number of moments, right? After he meets with President Xi Jinping in Mar-a-Lago down in Florida, he says afterwards that Xi had explained to him that actually controlling North Korea was a little bit harder than Trump might have thought. A little bit trickier problem, that China couldn't just call up the North Koreans and tell them what to do. And now he understood that. It's a little bit like learning that healthcare is a little bit more complicated than he thought. Similarly, I think he has been educated in a number of realms. And just as a footnote here, the same process, by the way, happened to Barack Obama when he became president. There were a number of things he had said he was going to do or was committed to as president that he began to be educated on and gradually changed his mind. So part of it is that Trump has learned more. A second problem, though, is that Trump actually, whatever you think of him and his ideas, faced a fundamental problem of personnel if he really was going to pursue a significantly different foreign policy. He could appoint a bunch of people who agreed with him, people sort of maybe from the Steve Bannon wing of American politics, and a few people like Mike Flynn, maybe Sebastian Gorka, et cetera, might be part of that wing. But these are all people with no substantial government experience. They've never really run the country's foreign policy. And if you appoint people who just agree with early Trump, they're going to make an enormous number of rookie mistakes. And we've seen a few of those already. Or you could appoint people who were experienced, who had done this before. Now, of course, some of those people opposed him in the campaign, but more importantly, those are people who are going to want to run the same old familiar foreign policy that he had run against. Or you could try to have a blend, have some new outside-the-box thinkers and some traditional experienced types, but that's a recipe for incessant warfare inside the administration, and we've seen some of that too. The point I'm suggesting, though, is that the establishment, the traditional forces, are far more numerous, far more experienced than the bomb throwers, and I think that's one of the reasons why they're ultimately winning on a number of key issues.
You wrote for Foreign Policy recently a piece reviewing the 100 days of the Trump administration with a question asking which of the many blunders of this administration have been the worst. You go through a litany of mistakes and reversals and signals, some of which you talked about just now, and come down to one fundamental blunder that you think is outpacing all of the other, and that is what you call his clueless approach to Asia. You made reference to his meeting with Xi Jinping, but why would you say the Trump administration's approach to Asia is clueless?
In part because it's been afflicted by a number of deep contradictions, and in part because I think he has simultaneously undermined the American position in Asia while wanting to do a variety of fairly difficult and ambitious things. So just run through this for starters. He begins, even before he's president, by taking a phone call from the president of Taiwan, which is contrary to normal protocol. We treat Taiwan with a certain delicate touch because of the relationship with China, and furthermore by questioning the one China policy that has been American policy ever since the 1970s. Right? This was an immediate sort of warning flag to Beijing, or red flag to Beijing. And maybe it would suggest a different American approach, maybe as part of getting tough with China, except then a couple of weeks later, they retreat from that. So having made a mistake, then they immediately suggest that maybe they don't really believe any of this stuff. This doesn't look like you've got a bunch of really competent people running. Second, on his third day in office, he declares that we're withdrawing from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now again, this has some controversial elements in terms of a trade pact, but it was a very important part of the Obama administration's pivot to Asia. And it was, I think, in America's economic interest, but more importantly, very much in our strategic interest to bind a number of these Asian countries more closely.
And you liked it for that reason, more
Yes.
than even the specifics, but just the idea that it created this pathway for communication and interconnectedness.
Pathway communication and enhancing our trade ties with a number of these countries, many of whom China is competing with us for trade access and things like that. Most importantly, a number of Asian leaders, such as Shinzo Abe, the Prime Minister of Japan, had paid a significant domestic price to get this agreement through in their own countries. And for the United States, who had spearheaded the initiative, to then walk away from it after they had paid a political price for it, undercut our position in Asia. So simultaneously, he's trying to sort of get tough with China and undercutting the American strategic position simultaneously. Then, of course, he has a rude phone call with the Prime Minister of Australia. I'll just remind everybody that Australia is a country that has fought in every war the United States has fought in since World War II. Right, there have been Australian soldiers present in Afghanistan, present in Vietnam, present in Iraq. Right, and to schedule a phone call that's supposed to last an hour, it's a get-acquainted call, and to berate the Prime Minister of Australia over their immigration policy, and then to cut off the phone call after a half an hour was not necessary. And this, by the way, if you looked at the Australian newspapers, this did not play well in Australia, as you might expect. And then finally, we've had this slightly comic opera dealings with North Korea. Now, North Korea is a serious problem. First, Trump says that China has to solve this problem. Then he learns, of course, that China maybe can't solve the problem or isn't going to solve the problem instantaneously. He at one point said, if China doesn't solve the problem, we'll solve it ourselves, without explaining exactly what that means. Is that a threat to use military force? Well, perhaps, but there are no attractive military options for dealing with the problem that is North Korea. At some point, he then announces that an armada, his words, is steaming towards North Korea, and as some of you probably know, it turns out at the moment he said that, the armada in question, a U.S. aircraft carrier flotilla, was actually steaming in the other direction. It eventually got there, but it was not quite the same signal. The difficulty in all of this is it betrays an administration that is not running things very smoothly or very competently. And it's not as though our Asian partners are questioning whether or not we're concerned about them, whether we're committed to them. They might have doubts about that too. But it's rather whether they can trust the United States to be competent, to know what it's doing, to not change its mind every 2 weeks or so. And one of the things I think we need to be able to sustain those sets of alliance relationships is a certain confidence on their part that if we say something in March, it'll still be true in April, and that the people charged with implementing whatever American policies are will know what they're doing.
Why is that so especially important in international affairs? What is the absence of that?
Well, if you believe that your key alliance partners are erratic, you're going to hedge. You're going to ask yourself, well, what are we going to have to do if they change their policy suddenly? If you think they're incompetent, that the people you're dealing with just don't know how to run the operation, then you also hedge. You can't count that when the United States goes to its allies and says, here's what we think we all should do together, others will be less inclined to listen if they don't think the people who are giving them this advice actually know what they're talking about. And the reason I said this was the biggest error so far was based on my belief that the Relationship between the United States and China is going to be the most fundamental relationship in world politics over the next 30, 40, 50 years. These will be the two most powerful countries, the two largest economies. Nothing's going to happen to change that in the next 30 or 40 years. And if that relationship gets managed well, then world politics may have its unpleasant elements, but it'll be okay. If that relationship really goes south, then the whole tenor of global politics will change dramatically. Because I believe it is in America's interest to remain engaged in Asia, and because I believe it is in America's interest that China not eventually emerge as a dominant power in Asia. In other words, China not emerge as having the same relationships in Asia that we have, say, in the Western Hemisphere, where China is effectively unchallenged in Asia. That requires the United States to remain engaged in Asia, have strong alliance partnerships in Asia. And everything that Trump has done that weakens those alliance partnerships undercuts our position, makes it more likely that China will eventually emerge as a much more powerful actor in its own neighborhood.
When we were chatting informally just before we started this conversation, you said you're actually relatively pessimistic on the prospects for the U.S. getting the relationship with China right. Beyond what the immediate concerns you've identified for the Trump administration, what more fundamentally makes you pessimistic? Is there something going on with the way we think about our place in the world and China's place in the world that's problematic?
Well, no, it's actually, I think it's more of a structural problem. First of all, the two most powerful countries in the world, regardless of how well they are led, always eye each other somewhat warily. Just as a matter of prudence, you have to wonder what the other 800-pound gorilla might do. And that's going to be increasingly true if China continues to grow, continues to become more powerful, continues to translate its economic capabilities into military capabilities, continues to try and push the status quo in Asia in a variety of ways. So we're probably not going to go to war, but we're going to eye each other warily. That's problem number one. Problem number two, as I said a moment ago, in a sense, we have opposing grand strategies. The United States would like to stay in Asia to prevent China from dominating Asia the same way we dominate the Western Hemisphere. Because when you think about it, if China were in the same position that we're in, with no real adversaries, no real opponents in its own neighborhood, other countries there being very deferential to China, then China would be free to roam around the world the way the United States roams around the world, causing trouble. The reason we can do that is that we don't have any enemies here in the Western Hemisphere. We don't have to really protect our own territory against anyone. And so the United States has, for a century, tried to make sure that no country, not in Europe, not in Asia, was in the same kind of dominant position. In order to achieve that, though, we can't do this by ourselves. We have to have alliances. We have to have people that will give us military facilities and countries, hopefully strong and successful countries, that will be part of a balancing coalition in Asia. When you look down the road at a powerful China in Asia, managing that balancing coalition is not going to be easy. Getting Japan and South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, possibly India and others, to coordinate their actions with hopefully a lot of American guidance and leadership is going to be tricky. Now, if you're the Chinese, you would like to get the United States out of Asia. You'd be much happier if the world's most powerful country didn't have close relationships and a substantial military presence near your country. That's why I think long term, you're likely to see a lot of competition between China and the United States, and much of it centering around Asia and Southeast Asia. So in order to win that competition or to succeed in that, we're going to need to have a lot of very smart, adroit, mature, sensible people in the US government helping manage those relations. And that's what worries me in the short term about the Trump administration, and in the long term over the fact that you can't just do this for a year or two. This is a long-term problem. It has to be done over 10, 20, 30, 40 years.
All right, well, let me pick up on that, because there is this narrative that's emerging out of Washington now with regard to the Trump administration that suggests, thank God, the establishment's coming to the rescue. We've got the adults, the folks who've done this before. And you're quite critical of the foreign policy consensus in Washington. You think that that's led us astray in many respects. So tell us more about why you're not a fan of that view of foreign policy.
This was, I hope, maybe implicit in a couple of things I said at the beginning. So our policy since the end of the Cold War is sometimes labeled one of liberal hegemony, right? Where the United States took upon itself to try and promote and expand a liberal world order. And by liberal world order, I mean a sort of rule-based system of increasing economic openness, increasing globalization, the gradual spread of democracy and human rights into various other places, all of this under benevolent American leadership. So this is what's involved in NATO expansion, spreading NATO eastward towards Russia. This is what's involved in trying to convert countries in the Middle East into democracies in various ways. And this is what's implicit when you hear people use phrases like the necessity for American leadership or the fact that the United States is the indispensable power, right? That the system only works if the United States is at the center and leading it. And this all sounds really great, especially if you're American, because it's consistent with all of our values. And this is very much what people thought was going to happen in the 1990s. That, we'd won the Cold War. The United States and its liberal democratic order was really the only game in town, and the whole world was gradually going to become like us. If you read Tom Friedman in the 1990s, that's what he was telling you. Right?
And this was also the sort of Fukuyama, the end of history.
Yeah, we've reached the end of history, and we are the only model that really works. Right? And so each president has, in slightly different ways, pursued this. Certainly, Bill Clinton tried to do this in a variety of ways with NATO expansion and some other policies. George Bush certainly tried to do it with the so-called Liberty Doctrine. Read his second inaugural speech sometime, where he declares that basically spreading democracy worldwide is America's mission. And Barack Obama, although he was more skeptical of this, also did a number of things that were very consistent with this. Escalating the war in Afghanistan, increasing reliance on drones, helping overthrow Muammar Gaddafi, promoting democratic change throughout the Arab Spring. And again, this is consistent with all of our values, but it doesn't work very well. Right, for two reasons. One, it's a highly revisionist strategy. We're basically saying, if you're not a government like us, we'd like you to be out of business. We are, in fact, officially committed to regime change, peacefully if possible, but if necessary, in some cases, through the use of military force. Well, once that becomes our policy, then a number of countries that feel threatened by it are going to do things we might not like to prevent that from happening, like acquiring weapons of mass destruction or reoccupying Crimea or a variety of other things. All right. The second thing is when we do succeed at toppling a government or overturning it, we don't get a nice liberal democracy. All right. We often get a failed state, like Iraq, like Libya, like much of Afghanistan, which of course then makes the terrorism problem worse and forces us to keep doing more in a variety of other places. So the strategy of liberal hegemony that we've followed for the last 25 years sounds good on paper, but works terribly in practice. And what's fascinating is, of course, Donald Trump ran for president opposing this. He said explicitly, we're going to get out of the nation-building business, which of course makes perfect sense. Now, for somebody like me, I would like to get out of that business too, and I would like to do a number of things that sound a little bit, not entirely, a little bit like what Trump was talking about back in the campaign. And so if he's being captured by the foreign policy blob, to use the phrase that Obama's chief speechwriter used for it, that's not necessarily good news, because it means we're gradually being drawn back to a set of policies that haven't worked very well for the last 25 years, but we've got an even more erratic person trying to implement these unwieldy set of policies. So I guess the way I'd put it is that this is kind of a missed opportunity, that if Trump had been a more sensible, disciplined, thoughtful politician, he might have been able to move us in a more sensible and prudent direction, but I think he's already missed that opportunity.
I want to talk more about what advice you would have given or what you would like to see, but I just want to stay with this critique for a moment because there are two things that come to mind. One is just to have you from a realist perspective, sort of transplant all of us to inside the Kremlin and help us understand what the moves of the last 25 years that the United States has made look like from the perspective of not only Putin, but other leaders inside Russia. So let's start there first, because I think sometimes we don't put ourselves in the position of another nation when it comes to our policy objectives.
Yeah, I think that's right. When I teach classes at the Kennedy School, one of the lessons I keep trying to instill as much as I can with my students is that you have to try and look at most foreign policy problems from the perspective of the other actors that you're dealing with. That doesn't mean you have to agree with them. That doesn't mean you have to think their worldview is correct. But if you don't understand how they see things, it's going to be hard to get them to do the things you want, hard to structure a set of responses that will move them in the right direction. And I think in the case of Russia, we have a situation where we have, for the most part, over 25 years, largely paid no attention to how our behavior looks to Moscow. So we are victorious in the Cold War. The Soviet Union falls apart due to mostly its own failings, but a certain amount of pressure. And the United States plays a very adroit diplomatic game in sort of taking the Soviet Union apart and consolidating our position in the former Warsaw Pact. In particular, getting the Russians to go along with the reunification of Germany, at which point James Baker, Secretary of State, makes some verbal pledges that NATO will not expand further east. These are never written down. This is not codified. It was a mistake of Gorbachev at all not to get this promise in writing, but he did say it verbally on more than one occasion. All right. Since then, what has the United States done? The United States has continued to move NATO eastward. Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Czech Republic, and then Poland, then eventually into the Baltic states. The United States proposes Georgia for former Soviet Georgia, but Georgia for NATO membership. That's turned down by the rest of NATO, but it's never officially withdrawn. And then the United States and the European Union begin to cultivate closer ties with Ukraine. With, I think, the best of intentions. That is to say, we weren't doing these things as anti-Russian moves. And every time the Russians protested, the American response was to say, this is not an anti-Russian gesture. We really are not doing this. We're doing this because these countries want to be part of the West, etc. But the point was not what we thought we were doing. The point was what the Russians thought they were doing. And one way to think about this is ask yourself just how sensitive the United States has tended to be whenever hostile powers were interfering in some fashion, even a very limited fashion, in the Western Hemisphere. So back in the 1980s, as some of you will remember, there was a revolution in Nicaragua, and the Sandinistas, right, started cultivating closer ties with Cuba and a little bit with Moscow. Nicaragua was a country of, 7 million people in those days, less than the population of New York City. The United States organized a rebel army, the so-called Contras, to overthrow the government of Nicaragua, even though it was a tiny country of no strategic importance whatsoever. Now, if we could do that, you can imagine how Russia, which is a much weaker country now than the Soviet Union ever was, Russia would be sensitive to the United States perhaps one day incorporating Ukraine, a former part of the Soviet Union, with 40 million people or so, into NATO. Right? And therefore, why Putin would do what he did, which we don't have to approve of or don't have to like, but we ought to understand the motivation, why Putin would do what he did. Now, you could add to that a number of other things. The United States tore up the Anti-Ballistic Missile Defense Treaty. The United States toppled Gaddafi, who had been a nominal Russian ally for a long time, even though the UN Security Council resolution didn't authorize overthrowing Gaddafi. And this is all part of a long Russian litany of places where the United States and its allies have taken advantage of Russian weakness or taken advantage of Russian vulnerabilities or the vulnerabilities of some Russian friends. The way Putin always puts it is that the United States is trying to unilaterally determine who can govern in different parts of the world. And I believe he also thinks that's true of our views towards Russia, that what we view as encouraging civil society, helping Russian democracy stabilize, he views as a potential threat to his rule. All of these things, I think, have poisoned the relationship between the United States and Russia, which is not to absolve Putin of his own misconduct, but it helps us explain why the relationship is as bad as it is today.
All right, so help us understand, in your view, how should U.S. foreign policy evolve to better manage and better handle these kinds of situations going forward?
First, I think we have to be much more realistic about what we can and cannot accomplish in the world. And we have to be much more hard-headed in defining where our interests are. Very simply, American security mostly rests on, as I said a while back, not allowing comparable powers, what you might call peer competitors, to dominate their own regions. That's why the United States entered World War I, to prevent Germany from dominating Europe. That's why we entered World War II, to again prevent Germany from dominating Europe or Japan from dominating Asia. And that's why we were worried about the Soviet Union possibly expanding into Europe or Asia. It's a very sort of realist, hard-headed view. And since World War II, that's also why the United States has occasionally gotten involved in the Middle East to prevent countries from possibly threatening access to energy there. Those are our big core strategic interests. And the question is, if there are threats to the balance of power in any of those regions, then the United States has to be ready to intervene. But if there are no threats to the balance of power in those regions, then American vital interests aren't threatened, and the United States can safely withdraw or stay out, and should. All right, so to just pick two examples, the United States doesn't really need to be in Europe to protect the Europeans now. Europe has 4 or 5 times the GDP of Russia, at least, 4 to 5 times the population, and the European members of NATO spend 4 times more than Russia does on their militaries every year. Think about that for a second. 4 times more than Russia does. So how is Russia a mortal threat to European security? And there are no other mortal threats to European security. There are security problems. They have a refugee issue that's a problem. We all have a certain concern for terrorism. But in terms of serious military threats, Europe has the wealth and wherewithal to defend itself. And therefore, what Trump should have done was say, Europe can defend itself. I favor European unity, which has not been his view. I favor the Europeans staying united, and the United States over the next 10 years is going to gradually withdraw its commitment to NATO. We might stay in the treaty, but we will no longer be involved militarily trying to protect them. But it's not going to be happening overnight. We'll do this in a collaborative way with our European friends. Similarly, the United States should disengage from the Middle East and resume the policy we followed from 1945 to 1990, where we acted like an offshore balancer in the Middle East. We had security commitments there, we had treaty partners there, but we did not have large military forces there. At no point in that period, except once briefly in 1958 in Lebanon. And then the first time we actually got actively involved was the first Gulf War in 1990-91. Third, we do have to, as I've already suggested, pay more attention to the situation in Asia. So I think Obama was right, that pivoting to Asia, focusing more strategic attention there makes sense, because that's the one place where the balance of power might be affected. We should be staying out of the nation-building business, and we should be not trying to fix countries that we don't understand until we know how to fix the United States, which we nominally understand a little bit better.
We're going to go to your questions here in just a second. I know there are many things that some of you will want to pick up on. So if I understand you correctly, you would actually go much further than the Trump administration on NATO, which has simply suggested that the U.S. reduce its contribution, the proportion of the defense budget that comes from the United States. You're saying to withdraw entirely, phased out over a period of a decade or so.
Either withdraw entirely or remain as a member of NATO, but now no longer militarily committed, right? That is to say, we would come into, if there was an attack on a NATO member, then the United States could mobilize forces. But we would not, for example, if there was trouble emerging, immediately feel like the American response was to send, an extra battalion or send an airborne unit or whatever. One problem we have now, given that we have allowed, one could even argue encouraged at times, Europe to let its military capabilities atrophy, that when trouble does happen today, yes, American reinforcements are necessary to reinsure a number of European countries. That's why you can't do this in 2 weeks, why you have to make it clear that you're going to start reducing the American commitment and allow the Europeans to then rebuild their forces. There's some evidence that they are starting to do that. But you don't necessarily declare that NATO is obsolete and that we're just going to get out.
Would that invite or create the possibility that those European leaders who are concerned about security or have a vested interest in the status quo deepen relationships with other players in the world, i.e. China or Russia or other powers that might be more threatening to the United States' interests?
This is a really interesting question, and I actually think we'll see this play itself out over the next 10 or 20 years. If I'm right that the real problem for the United States is going to be the relationship with China, and if the United States begins to focus a lot more attention on Asia and that particular competition, then you have to ask yourself, well, what's the European role there? And the answer is not much, right? It's not really in Europe's interest to help the United States deal with or balance China. There's no territorial problems, and in fact, Europe's economic interest will be to maintain a profitable economic relationship with China as the world's second largest economy, even to the point of selling them military technology, or at least technology that has military uses. Chinese submarines today have German diesel-electric engines in them, right? So if the United States in the Cold War went to its NATO allies and says, we don't think you should sell advanced technology to the Soviet Union, our NATO allies said, we agree, because they didn't want to make the Soviet Union any stronger. In 20 years, if we go to our NATO partners and say, we don't want you selling anything to China either, I suspect our NATO partners would say, what are you talking about? Of course we're going to do that. That's not our problem. It's not our particular concern. I could be wrong about that, but I believe that's actually going to create even greater frictions between the United States and Europe over time. Not to the point of serious rivalry, not to the point that we view them as our enemies or anything like that, but it's going to be harder to collaborate on that very fundamental issue because our interests are not going to be as aligned.
One last question before we take questions from all of you. There's certainly much in your approach that would resonate with popular opinion polls around foreign policy in terms of withdrawing from foreign intervention to such a significant degree as we saw in Iraq, et cetera, regime change, the opportunity to reduce defense spending in certain key areas and reinvest it back at home. However, one of the major critiques posed against realists is the whole question of human rights and American values in situations all over the globe where we've seen certainly historically, and we've seen now with Syria and so many other places, and Rwanda, and on and on. So what role should human rights play in the way we think about our engagements and our relations with others?
It's a great question, and I think it's one that people like me, but also almost every politician, every political leader ends up having to wrestle with, because it's inescapable that there are times when your moral instincts or your moral commitments are at odds with strategic imperatives or even economic interests. There are times when they're aligned, and that's very comfortable. We're sort of doing what's good for your overall power position is also consistent with values, but we constantly see these trade-offs, whether it's with allies who have very different political systems. We still have a close partnership with Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia doesn't look like a democracy, doesn't have the same human rights policies we have, et cetera. Today, right, President Trump has invited the President of the Philippines, Duterte, to visit the White House, even though Duterte is being investigated by The Hague for possible complicity in war crimes, in the conduct or gross human rights violations in the way they're waging this drug war in the Philippines. You could make a defense of that by saying it's shoring up a critical strategic relationship, and that's indeed the way the White House is spinning it. So this is a perennial problem. The way I try to square it, for what it's worth, is to say the United States, I think, consistent with its values, always has to take human rights concerns seriously and never sort of pretend that they don't matter, that they're not a concern. We are going to, on some occasions, make compromises with those values, because otherwise things are actually going to be substantially worse. We should, as a matter of practice, not endorse anything that makes human rights conduct worse, and we should be pushing both our allies and our adversaries on this. And then finally, even someone who has a sort of more restrained view of what our foreign policy ought to be has to recognize there are going to be times when we ought to use the power that we have for essentially purely humanitarian reasons. But we have to do that pretty realistically. That is to say, when we're confident that the problem is really a grave one, and when we're very confident that our action will in fact make the situation better. So I believe the Obama administration had the best of intentions when they went into Libya, but they didn't understand what they were getting into, and they didn't understand that they were quite possibly going to make things substantially worse. I also believe, by the way, that Barack Obama was wrestling with precisely this trade-off when he did not commit the United States to intervene more extensively in Syria. It is not true that the United States has not been involved with it. We've been involved there in a variety of different ways. But the decision not to get more deeply involved, I think, reflected his sense that we could easily make things worse as make things better, and that therefore that was one we were going to stay out of. I should mention those. I think these are amongst the hardest cases to ever reconcile or see a really clear path towards.
Yeah. Let's take your questions from the audience. We have let's see, microphone here. We've got a couple of hands here on the end, and we'll try to get around to as many of you as possible. Yes.
Thank you for that very succinct, I would say, geopolitical education. Two questions. One on Turkey. What do you think is happening in Turkey? And you think Turkey remains democracy 5 years from now, or even before that? And what do you think of the Iran deal, and where do we go with our relationship with Iran? Because these are really two very important countries that could determine what happens in that region.
Okay. With respect to Turkey, I think what's happening in Turkey is a tragedy. And I say that as someone who was really excited, even optimistic about what I thought incorrectly the AKP, the ruling party in Turkey, was attempting to accomplish early on. They had, I thought, successfully managed to move Turkey past its militarily dominated politics for a long time. They had opened up the educational system. They'd certainly streamlined and opened up the economy in a number of ways. And 10 or 12 years ago, they were pursuing what was then called the zero problems with neighbors foreign policy, which was, actually, if you look at what they were saying, I thought was just brilliant. They had figured out that Turkey was in this unusual position, partly for historical and cultural reasons, and partly for political reasons, and partly for geographic reasons, for basically being a hub. And they could talk to anybody for a brief period. They had ties with Iran, they had ties with Hamas, they had ties with Egypt, they had ties with Israel, they had ties with us, they had a good relationship with Russia. If you wanted to do business there, the Turks were the ones who could help you do political and diplomatic business. And I thought this was brilliant. And unfortunately, I believe this has succumbed to the personal ambitions of Prime Minister Erdogan, President, soon to be President for life, Erdogan. And the consequences of this are, I think, for Turkey, let alone the rest of the world, are going to be deeply unfortunate. I don't know of any country that has ever made itself better off by suppressing universities, by suppressing newspapers, by now suppressing Wikipedia as of this week, essentially closing itself off, encouraging its brightest people to leave and go elsewhere, stifling intelligent and patriotic dissent. I don't see any country that profits from doing that, and I think this will have inevitable economic effects on the Turkish economy, which has not done well in the last year or so, and is just deeply unfortunate. I think there was a path ahead for Turkey where it would have been more prosperous, more influential, and in a much better position. And, by the way, zero problems with neighbors a dozen years ago. Now, of course, Turkey's in a position where it's got problems with all of its neighbors. And again, partly because of, I believe, the willful responses of the prime minister. The Iran nuclear deal. I think the Iran nuclear deal was exactly the right thing to do. It culminated, of course, a long period where the United States attempted to stop Iran from developing a nuclear weapon by refusing to talk to it and by threatening to overthrow its government. And just a pro tip here, if you're trying to convince a country that it doesn't need a nuclear deterrent, threatening to overthrow the government is not the best way to do that. And the result of that policy, by the way, was that Iran went from having 0 nuclear centrifuges operating in the year 2000, 0, to having 19,000 or so by the time the deal was struck. The deal brought them back to 7,000 or so, and has a variety of safeguards and other measures and other changes that Iran has agreed to keep them some distance away from being able to develop a nuclear weapon. So I think the deal was a good deal, but that entire period is not a wonderful case study in effective American diplomacy, because we basically spent a dozen years refusing to talk to them, right? And that's usually not the best way to make a deal. Now, the only other thing I would say is my own view is that this is looking like something of a missed opportunity, because we should be exploring the possibility of having a much more cordial, business-like relationship with Iran. Not necessarily the best of friends, but we want to be on good terms with as many countries as possible, or at least on business-like terms with as many countries as possible in that part of the world. In part so we don't drive Iran into the arms of China, and in part so our other friends in the Middle East are incentivized to occasionally do some things to keep the United States happy. Right? If you're Saudi Arabia or Jordan or Israel or Egypt, if you know the Americans are also talking to Tehran, it gives you some incentives to occasionally do some things Americans would like, as opposed to taking American support for granted, which is the way most of our allies in the Middle East tend to do it.
Hand up there.
Continent you haven't mentioned is Africa, and I'd like to know what your feeling is about the movement from China to exert greater influence across the continent.
Africa is also the continent I know least about, which is why I say relatively little about it. But I'm actually more sanguine than most people are about the idea that China is going to acquire enormous influence over countries in Africa. China has an active economic role there, has been involved with a variety of infrastructure projects, et cetera. But I think they will discover what the United States and other major powers, including the Soviet Union, discovered in the past, that extensive economic ties to developing countries don't necessarily give you an enormous amount of political control. Right? That once you've invested someplace, then you're in a sense committed there as well. Your prestige is committed. Your costs are sunk there, and you can't necessarily get whoever's in charge to suddenly do your bidding by threatening to sort of, well, if you don't if you don't do what we want, we'll dismantle that dam and take it home.
Right.
It sort of doesn't work that way. And if the Chinese are investing in a lot of these places, they're going to have incentives to try and get along with whoever is running these different countries. So it's something I think keep an eye on, but I don't regard it as this sign of sort of, some kind of large-scale Chinese campaign to take over the world or anything like that. One thing you should note is, assuming China's economy continues to develop, they are going to exert more weight in world politics. That's what we've seen over the last 20 or 30 years, and there's nothing that the United States, I think, can or should do to prevent that, except, of course, compete ourselves by having our own economy perform as well as we can, and by having smart diplomats that can help persuade other countries to see things our way, as opposed to seeing things the Chinese way. We would like the American model, if you will, to continue to be a more attractive one than whatever the Chinese model might turn out to be. And I admit that President Trump may not be helping in that regard, but it is worth noting that there are relatively few American hedge fund billionaires busy buying condominiums in Shanghai so that they have a safe place to get to if things go south here in America. Whereas there are lots of Chinese millionaires and billionaires who would like to have property in the United States and would like to have a visa that would let them live here for opposite reasons. So we still have a number of attractive features here that may not be true in some other countries.
Take other questions. So we've got a hand there. We'll go two there.
This will be our last question, actually.
Oh my gosh.
I've talked too long.
Yeah, so one of the major changes that the current administration has brought about is that for the first time since George C. Marshall, we have a Secretary of Defense who is a former general. And it seems also that the current administration is giving the military a much freer hand in determining how to deal with military issues. What is your opinion with regard to these changes on foreign policy? Thank you.
The question is exactly right. The military presence in this administration is higher than in previous ones. That's not an entirely novel development. You could argue that this trend has been going on for a long time. You've had people like Colin Powell, who was also a general and who'd had a number of political roles in different administrations, who eventually ends up as Secretary of State. So it's not entirely novel with the Trump administration. In general, I think, first of all, civilian control of the military is a well-established principle, and therefore having James Mattis, a retired general, as Secretary of Defense is not a disaster in and of its own right, but it's not a great precedent. And that's not a criticism of Secretary Mattis per se. The bigger concern I have is that the number of key officials that have a military background, H.R. McMaster, who's now National Security Advisor, is also a retired general, is going to incline the administration towards what are essentially a set of easy options. We still have an incredibly capable military, and there's lots of things it's really good at doing. And a lot of those options are easy for a president to order, as we saw with the cruise missile strike into Syria. Right? You look like you're doing something, no Americans are killed, the costs have already been absorbed, et cetera. And by the way, Barack Obama found this hard to resist as well in his greater reliance on drones and special forces and things like that. And what troubles me about this is if you think about the last 25 years or so, the principal failures of American foreign policy have not been our inability to blow things up. Right? We're pretty good at that. And we're actually pretty good at defeating opposing armies. Right? No organized military force has been able to stand up to us in an actual battle. Where we have fallen short is our ability to craft political solutions that allow us to end those fights, whether in Iraq or in Afghanistan, or our inability to, say, broker an Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement, which is not a military failure on our part, it's a political and diplomatic failure on our part. So to rely more heavily on the military, and I'm not criticizing them, I'm just saying there's a limit to what they can accomplish, and at the same time say you want to cut the State Department by 2,300 jobs and 38%, seems to me you're not recognizing which parts of the American foreign policy establishment need to be built up and which parts are just fine at what their real job is, right? But remember that you're not going to ultimately solve very many diplomatic problems just by blowing things up.
Stephen Walt is the Robert and Renee Belfer Professor of International Affairs at Harvard University, also a contributing editor at Foreign Policy. Stephen, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time and your insights today.